Should I?
You can start.
I'll just, thanks. Well, sorry, go ahead.
Just to sort of like say how I guess we both arrived at making a show together.
Yeah.
I think it started that we both sort of individually had an idea for a film, for these two films, and through conversation about that realized that they could kind of start to be in conversation with each other together. So we sort of didn't conceive it as a show as such, but we sort of came to each other with these ideas for individual works we wanted to make and realized that they could work, and then from there it sort of expanded.
Yeah. I think an important preface for viewing the show, which is not written anywhere, is that when we had come to each other with these ideas, it was like mid-2020, and then we were meant to show the work in April or May 2020, and then of course COVID happened, and so we ended up showing a kind of online version, which wasn't that successful. And there's something I don't know how to think about it or unpack it, but I've really been thinking the last few days since this has been installed that that kind of time that we were somewhat afforded in actually putting the show on is definitely informing the work. I certainly think about time a lot and sort of wanting to have a kind of nuanced engagement with my practice, and so that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is like why it's happening now and what that means for the work. But should we talk about the videos?
Yeah. I think another thing that sort of the two videos have in common is because we were planning to make them, and then COVID limited how we could travel. So you left the UK, came back to Canada, and I was working on something separately in the Highlands in Scotland, so I couldn't go and do any filming myself. So we both ended up asking somebody else to do the recording for us. So we weren't actually really that in control of what was being filmed. I think that was a huge kind of compromise at first, but it's completely changed how the work was made for both of us.
Yeah.
But do you want to talk about your film a bit?
Yeah, I will. So initially I had this idea for, there's this town in England on the southwest side called Swindon. And I have like 3 to 4 generations of immigration lineage in this town. So like my great-grandfather moved here somehow. No one seems to know what the means were to get him there. And then my father, and then now I have lots of cousins and uncles there. And for some reason, all the men in my family that still live in this town, they sort of lead nefarious lives, and I've always been interested in that and their kind of refusal of this idea of the good immigrant, and their refusal of a kind of a linear upward mobility progress that is often mapped upon immigrants. So just very simply, I wanted to think about the way they lead their lives. And in Swindon, there's this intersection called the Magic Roundabout. And it's a series of 6 roundabouts. There's one central one, and then there's 5 that surround it. And so the initial idea is that I would go down to Swindon, and I would maybe with a cousin or an uncle, we would drive into the roundabout and not exit, and just keep driving within, in order to then maybe talk about some of these stories of bad men. And but of course, like Andy talked about, COVID happened and that was impossible. So I got in touch with a local filmmaker, and I said to him exactly that. Can you drive into the roundabout and not leave? Or how long can you do that for me? And so the next day he sent me a video file, and it was an hour and 15 minutes. And one take. And so I sort of had, all of a sudden I had this kind of stage for a text. And I started to write this text to the rhythm of the circles and the movement of the car. And what ended up happening is that I don't actually tell any stories in it. I don't really reveal any real details of family history in it. And it's a kind of, I guess in a way, it's a sort of refusal of how these kind of stories might, be understood in spaces that we operate. And I mean, galleries and et cetera, et cetera. And it's also, I don't know, because we made it at the time we made it, I was also very frustrated at that time. I was very angry. I was thinking a lot about radicality and how do you do that? Like, how do you have a kind of generative, meaningful life in thinking about progressive, radical ideas when you're like stuck at home? I also was thinking at this time a lot about the margin and the center, and who occupies the space of the margin, who occupies the space of the center, and how in the kind of last few years when there's seemingly been a really interesting rupture in cultural institutions to have more diversity, more representation. Really, at this time of making this film, I was really feeling a lot of anxiety of how the center is still being upheld, even with these kind of this openness. So yeah, obviously, here. This whole film is really about dipping into the center, coming back out, staying in the margins, going back in. And I only, until we installed this now and I actually watched it not on a laptop, I realized that he doesn't actually go into the center that often. He sort of is staying very much in the margins, and then in this kind of movement really into the center is some of the most nauseating parts of the film.
Yeah.
I think I'll stop there. I'm sure we'll get into more content. But
maybe a little bit of like extra, just tiny bit of context. The Magic Roundabout was a like British children's TV program in the like 1970s or something. Like very cute kind of like models, and that'll be why it's been ironically named after this. But you described the roundabout as a vortex. It's just like this kind of like swallowing in kind of thing, which I really liked.
Yeah.
The film that I made then, on the other showing on the back of this screen.
Walk around.
Is that it? We don't need to walk around. It's fine. It might be a bit complicated to fit everybody in there. There's a piece of land close to where I grew up, which is in the north of England, which has this like very insane kind of saturation of really weird presences in it. But on the surface of it, it's just extremely boring agricultural land. But it's like a very saturated site of prehistoric stone carvings. And a huge amount of the valley was flooded sequentially through the sort of Victorian era, industrial era, up to now, to create reservoirs to sort of feed water to the big industrial cities a little bit further south. And then in the sort of Cold War time in the 50s, there's a compulsory purchase of a huge parcel of land on a high vantage point by the Royal Air Force, I think. And then that was leased to the Americans to have a radar station, a listening station, surveillance station, which is still operating today. In fact, it's expanding all the time. And that's called Menwith Hill. And that's depicted in these paintings. And when you sort of see it, you see it sort of creeping in a little bit in some of the shots in the video. But you can see it from all around. And people who live locally just refer to it as the golf balls, because the radomes resemble golf balls. But there's no sort of local public interest in what happens in the station. So it's just this huge, silent, massive, bizarre sci-fi kind of sculptural imposition on this ancient English landscape. So I wanted to do something that sort of looked at the sort of saturation of signals and meaning and communications in this kind of very empty looking land. And then obviously couldn't travel there because of COVID travel limitations and things. So I just asked my parents to go and do some filming for me. Because they still lived, at that point they lived locally, but they were about to move for the first time in generations. They're about to move away. So in a way it's this kind of strange portrait of both my dad and the place on the edge of a sort of incoming change. I just gave him some really simple instructions. I sort of told him, I bought him some lenses from Amazon, these really cheap lenses which you clip onto your smartphone so you can zoom. And I told him to go and find this stone carving which he knew about but had never seen before, although he spent most of his life in the sort of environs of this valley. And to just sort of record what he saw on the way. So if there's any interesting agricultural activity, if there's any curious aspects of the landscape, he should just record it and send me it, and I would make a film out of it, try and make a narrative. And then I realized that it did need a sort of, when I looked at this footage that he gave me, I said, it does need a sort of thread. So I interviewed him over Zoom and just sort of asked him what happened on the day that he went to film. And then this little anecdote came out that he had been sort of coercively removed from some of this land by the landowner, who'd seen him and realized that he shouldn't be there or shouldn't be there, and asked him to leave in this kind of very polite, very repressed kind of English way. And I thought there's a lot going on with this about sort of like the idea of public and private land boundaries and these, because this is a place where the RAF Menwith Hill station is intruding always into your private life. I should say about the station, it's the site from which the National Security Agency in the States conducts a lot of its intrusions into your private device, into your smartphone. And it's also the site from which really high-profile drone strikes have been conducted in the Middle East in recent years and still are. And it's also Edward Snowden's leaks concerned activity going on in this base in the north of England. The site where the stone carving is, one of the more interesting stone carvings is called Snowdon Car. It's a very ancient name of this outcrop of rocks, which is just this insane synchronicity with the Edward Snowden kind of whistleblowing. So I just kind of wanted to dig into all of this stuff. I also, before my parents left, I went down late 2019, I think, and I filmed a little bit around there as well myself. So some of my footage is in the film. And when I got home, I just filmed it on my phone. I realized it was all corrupted. Like it was just like really, really broken kind of footage. And I realized, obviously, this entire area will be under incredible surveillance, even though it doesn't seem like it because it's just farmland. And I thought, I wonder if there's been some kind of program or something that's stopping people from recording images of the station. And so when it came to edit the film, I just decided to really work with that. And I used this process called data moshing, which is like you remove keyframes from the encoding of the video so that the video refers to previous frames when it's looking for the information about where the pixels are moving, and you get this mashing of the images across each other. And I like this idea of like making a really specific kind of focused kind of analog intervention into the digital fabric of the digital film. So that's why it has this like degraded kind of quality to it. And finally, I think that's kind of pointing as well to this idea that and I'm sure you share this, I can't see England as anything other than completely rotten. Like it's just the rotting, decomposing center of this centuries of hideous kind of empire and exploitation around the world. And to live in England at the moment, or to be situated in England at the moment, is a deeply depressing experience because it's just degrading so much. So I wanted to present this little kind of film portrait of this beautiful English countryside that was just like morally and physically crumbling, I guess. Not to be too down on it, but yeah. So those are the films.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.